Welcome back to ManaTutor MTG Draft. If you haven't checked out our last episode where we went over draft archetypes, our thoughts on the big picture of the format, and usual grading-backed color and archetype rankings that we do with each set when it releases, we recommend you go check that out. But in this episode, we'll go over our biggest grading differences and our top commons and uncommons that we see in the set. So without further ado, let's dive into the cards.
We're going to go through some of our top commons and uncommons in this set. And these are cards, as a reminder, that we both rated very highly. In the case of the uncommons, these are cards where we had them both at a B or better. And then the top commons are cases where we both had them at a C plus or better. Now, remember, in our grading scale, B or B minus is what kind of draws you into a color. C plus is like a premium common, that you probably want to be looking to help fill out your deck. So that kind of gives you an idea of where we're thinking these cards lie. And so first up, we have Road Rage. For 1 red, you get an instant, deals X damage to target creature or planeswalker, where X is 2 plus the number of mounts and vehicles you control. So at a minimum, you're getting a shock here. But the sky's really the limit on this card. Like you get 1 mana for 5 damage is not off the table. 6 damage is not off the table. Now you can only hit creatures or planeswalkers, right? So you're not going to be able to finish out a game with this and target your opponent, but that's still a lot of damage potentially for 1 mana. What do you think, Jeremy?
Well, I love this card. It's extremely hyper efficient, and instant damage in this set will be more important than it has been in the past because their vehicles are protected on your turn, basically, and on their turn, when they crew them, they become unprotected, right? Becoming the creature where you can do this kind of effect. So I definitely like this instant speed removal in this set.
Yeah, and another thing to note, this is the kind of thing that will be super efficient to use in response to your opponent's exhaust triggers, right? Things like that, where you want to be able to kill their creature. This is probably going to be able to reliably get it done, and it only requires you to save 1 mana.
Up next, we have Veteran Beast Rider. We read this before in our signpost, so we're not going to go over it again, but we both agreed that this is a pretty powerful signpost card.
Absolutely. Yeah. And just the very efficient rate, and then that ability to just be able to untap everything and threaten to pump whenever you have the mana available. So next up, we have Detention Chariot, which is a 6/6 artifact vehicle for 4 colorless and 2 white. You get, when this vehicle enters, exile target artifact or creature an opponent controls until it leaves the battlefield. It has crew 3, and it has the ability to cycle for 1 white mana. It's an at-rate card, which is really good generally. You're going to be playing this in white decks, which could be things like blue-white, where you might have ways to lower the cost of it, or get additional effects. And then the fact that this is basically a 2-for-1, gets something on the board, gets an artifact or creature your opponent controls off the board, is going to give you some huge swings at the end of the game.
We talked earlier about liking cards that are cheaply costed that have cycling because you can use them early or get rid of them late for free, right?
This is the opposite.
The opposite, I also like. I especially like it when it's very cheap cycling because early on, you are going to want to be making plays and not spending 2 mana on cycling per se, but you can oftentimes get away with having 1 extra mana around and still adding to your board even early in the game. So if you are too far away from playing this powerful card, you can easily get rid of it for something else, need a land or whatever, but it is also, primary case, a very powerful card in removing an opponent's creature and leaving you a permanent around as well on top of that. So I like that duality.
Yeah, and I would note that with the cycling on this, you mentioned earlier, I think there's a white graveyard recursion, there's a black graveyard recursion card. So cycling this away early and then being able to bring it back for 5 mana, I think it costs, is the black one that brings something back. There's a white one, I think that might be 4. I can't remember the mana cost on it, but you could even get this card a little bit cheaper. And get the cycling benefit out of it too, depending on how you play it. So there's a lot of ways to play this card.
Up next, we have Sky Crash. You're going to keep on seeing a bunch of efficient removal on our list because that's kind of what the set is built as. So, 1 and a red for an instant, destroy target artifact, cycling red. What's not to like about this in this set?
Absolutely.
There's
Yeah. No,
artifacts
normally I
everywhere.
wouldn't like this card,
Yeah,
but like
right.
this set's got plenty of vehicles and artifacts, so I would easily mainboard this in any deck.
Yeah. Funny
And if
thing
you
is,
don't even have a target for it, okay, fine. You're just cycling
right.
it. So that's
Exactly.
fine.
Like I'd almost play this in some other sets too, where artifacts are at least around, right? Because the
Right.
cycling 1 cost is so cheap. But this in this set, this is destroy whatever you want. Nearly, I mean, yes, there's creatures, it doesn't do that, but it's cycling 1. Like, fine.
Right. If on the off chance that there's no legal targets on the board that you want to use this on, okay, great. You get it, it's at that point a cantrip that does nothing. All right, so next up we've talked about this one, Broadside Barrage, so we won't go over all the stats again, but I mean again, premium removal, low cost, gets you a card. There's nothing to not like about this. 5 damage for 3 mana is just at instant speed is really good.
And lastly, on our uncommons, we also talked about Haunt the Network. Really good card. This card reminds me of Triplicate Spirits from Pioneer Masters, except it is 1 mana less, and you get 2 colorless Thopter artifact creature tokens, but the drain life is definitely a big component of this being valuable as well.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So I think next up we have our commons that we both rated very highly. And first up is a great one with Ride's End. I think I messaged you when I saw this card and I was like, that's an insane card in this set particularly. At glance, it cost 5, 4 colorless and a white for an instant to exile target creature or vehicle. But the fact that this costs 3 less to cast if it targets a tapped permanent, right, that you're going to be playing this basically for 2 almost every time. The fact that we have both both saddle and crew in this set to tap down permanents, you're going to be able to use this basically on whatever you want. And the fact that this is a premium removal common to be able to get rid of basically anything your opponents have. And usually do it for 2 mana, which is just insane. So
I do think you still want to be putting this primarily in your control based decks, but based upon what you said, I agree. It's interesting, like, how good is this maybe even in aggro decks, given the crewing, given the, everything else that's going to be going on. So I wonder how much this creeps into aggro decks on top of where it usually does. Usually this is a completely bipolar card, like
right.
only good in control, not really doing aggro, right? And I think it'll be a bit better in aggro, even though in this set, right? Even though I still might cut it from my aggro decks, I would imagine most of the time.
I think it'll depend, right? But I do think the fact that I would play this in aggro simply because this way you don't have to fear the crackback as much. Like if you're trying to attack in, and you think your opponent's going to not block or whatever because they don't want to lose their creature or they want to just be able to crack back. Like, I mean, this is the kind of thing that you can save because it's only 2 mana, potentially 2 mana at that point. But I do think it will really shine just as you crewed your artifact. Okay. In response, I'm going to blow up whatever you crewed it with. Right. So, I mean, or let you attack with your artifact, your big vehicle. And sorry, you already crewed it. And now it's gone too. So you have nothing,
Yeah.
I mean, this is almost a 2-for-1 in that regard, right? Because if they crew the vehicle and then attack with the vehicle, you blow up the vehicle and their creature's still tapped until their next turn. So, I really like this card in a number of different scenarios. I just think it's absolutely very efficient removal in this set particularly. I don't normally like this card, and we get a version of it in basically every set, but it's normally just it costs less if it targets a tapped creature. But the fact that you have so many things that are going to be tapping down in this it's gonna really, I think, make a huge difference.
Up next, we have Spin Out, basically a version of Murder that includes vehicles this time. We always like that card. It's usually a C plus to a B minus, sometimes a B depending on the set. I don't think it'll be quite that here, but I still a good card, a card you, as long as you're reasonably heavy black, never going to be cutting from your deck.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think we had a version of this in Pioneer Masters that was Planeswalker, creature Planeswalker, and it was really good the first couple of weeks when Planeswalkers were in. So, I think we're, similarly looking at this, just given the number of vehicles. This is going to hit basically everything. So, it's good, efficient removal to take things out. So next up, we have Run Over. Again, with the theme of good, cheap removal. Costs, one colorless, one green for an instant. It costs one less if it targets a mount or vehicle you control. Target creature you control deals damage to its power to equal to target creature and opponent controls. I guess help me with this. When would this not target a creature you control? You have to as part of the spell.
No, but it's a mount or vehicle. It can target a creature you
Oh,
control.
yes. Yeah,
Mount,
yeah, yeah. You're
yeah.
right. Yeah. Okay. But you have enough mounts or vehicles, right? That this is potentially going to cost one a lot. At the very least, though, it's still a bite spell that costs two at instant speed, which is pretty good.
Yeah, nothing really to add. This is a overpowered bite spell. Usually the bite spell is already 2 mana. This just does it better. Yeah.
And sometimes the bite spell's only at sorcery speed. So the fact
Yeah.
that this is at instant is also just a huge bonus for it.
Up next, we have Lightning Strike. Oldie but goodie. Always has been
Right.
good. Always will be good.
Right. Yeah.
Nice to be able for 2 mana to take care of anything or even potentially go face. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it has no downsides as a card. It's just good. Next up, again with removal, we've got one colorless and one. We've got Collision Course for one colorless and one white. It's only a sorcery, so I think it's a little bit less good than some of the other ones we've had. But we have Choose One. It deals X damage to target creature, where X is the number of permanents you control that are creatures and/or vehicles, or destroy target artifact. I mean, this is. There was a set in Murders of Karlov Manor that I think it was a case that when it came into play, it dealt one damage for each creature you controlled at white, and it was really good if you had a wide board. And this is a similar, similar situation, right? So you're going to want a wide board for this, but it's also just potentially very useful to blow up a vehicle or an artifact. So.
All right, we finally have a vehicle on this list. Uh, and it's a common too. But I do think this is a role player, and I think this one is people aren't quite sure what to make of it. A lot of people are rating it high, a lot of people are rating it low. I think we both maybe had this at a C plus, so we're kind of like right in the middle there, like not quite pulling us into red or anything, but still a good card. So Burner Rocket for 1 red, you get a 3/1 vehicle with crew 1. It has flash. When this vehicle enters, target creature you control gets +2/+0 and gains trample until end of turn. So it's sort of a combat trick. 2 mana 1. We don't love 2 mana combat tricks, but it does come with a permanent as well with the crew 1, which is nice. So a role player in your aggro decks, and love giving things more power and trample on top of that.
Yeah, I really like this because of the trample, honestly,
Yeah.
because this is going to play really good with Start Your Engines decks because this is going to help you get that damage into your opponent, right? And so it's going to, you may lose the creature, and that may be by design. Trade into their biggest creature, deal 1 or 2 to them, and, take your speed up another notch, right? And then you've got this sitting on the board still. That next turn, as long as you have something to crew it with, you can, potentially swing in again. And so I think this is actually going to play most prevalently probably in either white red or more likely black red. And then that's what the role I think for this card is. It's going to be in some of those Start Your Engines very aggressive decks where you're just like, I need to deal damage to their face in order to get my speed up. So next up we have Crash and Burn, more removal for 3 colorless and 1 red. You get an instant. Choose one. Destroy target vehicle, or Crash and Burn deals 6 damage to target creature or planeswalker. We see a version like this in most sets as well for 6 damage. It usually costs 5.
Exactly.
And this costs 4. And it's an instant. And you can destroy target vehicle. So the flexibility on this card, I think, makes it really good. I don't love 4 generally as a cost, but the fact that, you know, 6 damage is still pretty good for 4 mana. So it's going to
Yeah,
kill mostly anything on the board.
yeah, not tagging this as the best removal in the set or anything, but a very viable card. 4 is much better than 5 for these kind of effects, and it does both the things you want. 6 damage kills most things. There are some things definitely in the set that this won't kill, but in those cases where you need to get a vehicle as well, like that'll come up obviously. So, yeah, pretty decent card to fit your removal slot on the high end when you need that. So this is also good for things like your aggro decks that are playing cheap creatures and need to get a big thing out of the way to keep moving through, right? So those types of your blue reds, your white reds, this will play into that. Black red even will play into those.
Yeah. This could be sort of like a top cost card in some of those really aggro decks that you just throw 1 or 2 of these in there just to help clear the way.
Up next, we have Leonin Surveyor. For 1 and a white, you get a 2/2 creature. This might be our first creature on the list. So this kind of goes towards what we were saying earlier. There's not a whole lot of really like extremely powerful creatures at common and uncommon, right? So you get a creature, Scout Cat. It does have start your engines, important thing on turn 2. During your turn, this creature has first strike. So this thing can attack in pretty easily where they're not going to want to block, thus helping your speed go up.
Yep.
And then it has, there's a cycle of these in each color, but at max speed, you get to exile this card from your graveyard and draw a card for 3 colorless, which is, a nice kind of added card advantage to your game plan there.
Yeah. No, I'd say this is just generally a fairly efficient card. I mean, it's at rate 2/2 for 2, but you get that first strike on your turn, which just kind of pushes it over a little bit, and then eventually you'll hit that max speed. And even if this has died at that point, it's going to give you a little bit more out of itself. So it's really efficient in a card, and that's what you want to see in your commons, basically. So next up, we have Night Market, the first land that we have. I think the only land we have in our top commons and uncommons. For this, it enters tapped. As it enters, choose a color, tap it, add 1 mana of the chosen color. It also has cycling 3, which is a very high cost to pay for cycling. So you're probably very rarely going to do this if you draw it really late in the game. But it's good color fixing, right? That's basically why we have this in here. You're going to need it occasionally. And the fact that you can choose the color is really nice. And while it enters tap, it'll pay off down the line, and it will really let you, potentially open you up to splashing a color or, whatever you might need.
You can consider playing this in even like a monocolor deck. Like I'm not saying I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of monocolor decks in this format, but it does keep you from flooding as well. So that even though the cycling cost is high, you don't want to cycle lands until the late game anyways when you already have too much mana, right? Like by definition. So it doesn't really matter that much that it's cycling 3. That's so expensive.
Yeah, I'd say that's true. And I think that, I would agree as well. In certain monocolored or 2-colored decks, you would probably want this. You don't want this in an aggro deck, right? I would probably not want to play this in an aggro deck just because you don't want your lands to enter tap. But if in a controlled deck situation or a deck where you just really don't have any turn 1 plays, I mean, I think this is probably a good addition.
I'm maybe a little more open to play this in my aggro deck, but it coming into play tapped is definitely a cost for sure. Up next, we have another creature, but this one's an expensive one. We got a 3 mana and +1 blue for a 3/2 creature. When this creature enters, create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying. As we mentioned earlier, any creatures that come into play with enter the battlefield another creature, like pilots are going to matter for things and they might be able to pick off just with all the efficient removal we saw, they might pick off the 3/2, but it'll leave you with a 1/1 flyer, which is enough to crew most of the vehicles that you're looking to play. And just having an additional 1/1 flyer on board is nice. So this is a pretty decent creature for 4 mana in general. And in this set specifically, I do think that this will be a role player in what you need to get your creatures out to balance your creature to vehicle balance.
Absolutely. This is basically Gear per Gear Crafter from Pioneer Masters. It costs one more, but you get that bonus power on it, and you still get the the 1/1 flyer. But I think it's going to be better in this set, even despite the additional cost, specifically because this is like 2 pilots for your vehicles, right? You can pilot something with Crew 3, you can pilot something with Crew 1 with it. Like, it's really going to help enable that, and I think this is going to have a really good role in any deck where you have any significant number of vehicles.
Yeah, I do think the additional mana will cause this to be graded slightly lower than Gearcrafter, but I agree with the premise that in this set it's important to have more creatures to be able to crew.
And so last up on our top commons and uncommons, we have the first artifact that's not a vehicle. And we have Grim Bauble. For 1 black, you get an artifact that when it enters target creature an opponent controls gets -2/-2 until end of turn. And it has the later ability that you can cast for 2 colorless and 1 black to sacrifice it and surveil 2. Right. So I like this because it's good, cheap removal. Early on in the game, it's going to hit a lot of different things. Obviously, it's only at sorcery speed, but you'll still be able to remove potentially some of your opponent's pilots, or a threat on the board that maybe only has 2 toughness. Like, there's some of those. We talked about a number of 3/1s. This hits that really well. And then it's not just dead on board, because it has that later ability that you can cast, and sink some mana into to get a surveil off, to help set up your draws, or maybe put some things in your graveyard that you can recur, or whatever you want, really. So
I even just like the fact that this is an artifact within the, black blue cares about artifact count, like we saw with Haunt the Network, making the drain based upon number of artifacts you have in play. So there are some synergies there as well.
Just going to play, the Haunt the Network and like 12 copies of Grim Bauble, and just,
there you go.
Haunt the Network for like 12. So next up, we're going to go through some of our biggest grading differences. Now, these are situations where either I or Jeremy graded these cards, at least 1 full grade higher than the other person, right? So 4 or greater difference in terms of our overall total grades. And so the first up are our commons. All of these were ones where I rated them higher than Jeremy did. And so first up, we have Guidelight Matrix. For 2 colorless, you get an artifact. When it enters, draw a card. It has 2 different modes. You can pay 2 and tap it. Target mount you control becomes saddled, activated only as a sorcery. Or 2 colorless and tap it. Target vehicle you control becomes an artifact creature until end of turn. And so I really like this card because first of all, it replaces itself, right? Mm-hmm. So you get it, you draw a card. Sure, you have to pay the 2 mana to cast it, but I really like it because it can function. It can pilot anything or saddle anything for 2 mana. We've talked a little bit about how you're going to have mana sinks later on. I might be high on this at a B, but I would definitely take this fairly highly, as long as I'm in a deck where I know I'm going to have even a remotely significant number of either vehicles or mounts, or both, right? Because this is going to see a lot of use, I think, in those situations. It allows you to get away with playing a little bit less in terms of the creatures. You don't have to worry about the crew cost necessarily, as long as you have the mana to activate this. And so I think it's going to come in handy a lot of times.
Where you are kind of talking me up on it is the fact that there's such good removal in the set otherwise, that like the creatures that could crew things might get killed. And yes, you could, somebody could kill this artifact, but you already drew your
Right.
card off of it. So like, that's not a great
Right.
plan, right? Where I'm low on this is just the 2 mana is a lot to pay to be able to crew something. I'd rather, tap something I already, like a creature I already invested 2 mana in right up front. That's another creature on top of that, to be crewing my thing. So, I have a hard time thinking I'm going to want to spend 2 just to crew something for a turn in general, and that's where I'm low. I'm going to stick at a D plus, but I see a role for it, right? Like D plus means I'd play it in some decks, and maybe I'm low, but we'll.
Yeah, like I said, I'm probably fairly high on this at a B. It's probably more like a C plus, or maybe a B minus. But I do think it will have given the number of vehicles. Again, I think it depends too on the deck, right? If you have a lot of crew threes or something like that, this is obviously much better than if you have a bunch of crew ones, because it's easier to crew those with just a tiny 1/1 pilot or something like that. All right, next up we have light wheel enhancements. This is an aura, cost 1 white, enchant creature or vehicle. It has start your engines, and it is enchanted permanent, gets +1/+1 and has vigilance. And at max speed, you may cast this card from your graveyard. So I really like this because the normal thing that you get, or that you worry about, with auras is getting 2 for 1. I think this is mitigated pretty significantly because of that max speed ability on the card. You're going to get this early on, hopefully, right? You're hoping to get this pretty early on. It's such a cheap cost that you can play this potentially turn 2, turn 3 on a really cheap creature to start your engines, and then be able to attack in with it. And then even if the creature dies or something like that, when you get to that max speed, you can just bring this back basically every turn, and give something vigilance. So yeah, it costs the 1 mana, but it's 1 mana. Late in the game. So I think this card is going to perform pretty well overall, especially in those decks that are trying to get to max speed.
Yeah, I just find it hard to find room for this in your deck when you're going to need a critical mass of creatures and your vehicles and your removal. How are you going to get an enchantment into that, right? And that's really where I see this tough, is like, where does this fit on in? I'd rather sort of just play an earlier creature. Now, I get if you have a creature in your opening hand and you have this in your opening hand, that is pretty powerful. Like, this will see some starts where you turn 2, turn 3, start your engines and get on in, probably because they can't block it with the +1/+1 that is added, right? And so it really does help your speed. And then later on in the game, you still get the benefit from it. That is enticing, but I also hate, like, when this is a late draw, it's still not that impactful. So like, those are the reasons why I don't see me putting in a deck and playing it. But yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, I hear where you're coming from. This might be your 41st card, right? Like, this might be that card that gets cut, and that might be true, right? Like, we'll have to see how it shakes out. I think you could find room for 1 copy of this in a deck where you're really trying to get to the start your engines, and it's like your 7th or 8th card that has start your engines on it. But I think it's only really good in those aggro decks, I think, and so it's going to find use in certain archetypes, but not others.
That's where I think I see this role player is when you are a start your engines deck and your draft didn't give you enough, right? Like, you need to start your engines. All right, this is where I'm getting it.
That's fair. Yeah, I might be a little high on it, but we'll see. All right, so next up we have Siphon Fuel. So for 4 colorless and 1 black, you get an instant. Target creature gets -6/-6 until end of turn, and you gain 2 life. I mean, I like this because it's good removal. I like the -6/-6. I like the little bonus of 2 life. I think it's very similar to the 6 damage for 4 mana. For 1 extra mana, you're gaining 2 life. I know that makes a difference, but I still think it's pretty decent removal, and I would probably play this I would only play this in a control deck. But if I was playing black, I would be tempted to play control, and I think this would find a spot in there.
Yeah, I guess that's why I have it at D plus, right? Like if I need the filler, I still consider this filler. And it's playable. It is still your 5 mana removal in a set filled with way better removal all over the place. So like again, where are you gonna find your spot for it? Assuming you picked up your removal. This is if I
Well,
didn't
yeah,
pick up my removal.
you have to see where it fits. I
Yeah.
rated this lower, I think, than most of the other removal I found because I rate removal so high, I was like B plus, and then like this got a B minus because it's not as good as some of that other removal. But it's still removal, and I like it. So
All
I mean,
good.
I'm probably too high. It's probably more like a C, but like
Yeah.
I think it's above. I think it's a little bit above filler. But
I know you have an eye for removal. No worries, Matt.
yeah, I love my removal. So.
Moving on to the uncommons, we're starting with the cards that I rated higher than Matt. We have Roadside Blowout. This type of card shows up in a lot of sets. Bounce something, draw a card for 3 mana, and it's always good. I don't really care that much about the bouncing a 1 mana value thing for 1. It's a nice buyout. If I don't have 3 mana to spend, I can have a little bit of advantage and draw a card. But yeah, I have a hard time seeing this perform any lower than the B range, like B minus maybe, just because I've seen how it performs in other sets. So by comparison, like
Yeah, I think that my
Geyser.
low rating on this is just because I never liked this card. I know that it performs well, but I still don't like it. Um, you know, eh, I mean, I like that it has draw a card. Some of these times it's just bounce and it doesn't have draw a card, but still, I mean, I'd rather find better. I'd rather play something that actually removes the spell. And there's so much other better removal in the set, as we've already kind of established. Like this one, there, yes, it's tempo. It delays them. They're going to play it again. But I mean, I'd just rather blow it up. And there's so
It
much
says draw
removal.
a card on it, and you're going to be playing nothing but removal, man. This reads draw a removal spell, delay a turn.
I guess, yeah. I mean, I guess if I'm playing blue black and playing nothing but removal plus like one big creature to win the game. Or no, I'm just playing Haunt the Network, right? I'm just playing 12 copies of the Bauble and Haunt the Network and then 4 roadside blowouts, right? Um I wouldn't get 4 roadside blowouts, it's uncommon, but still.
Moving on to Transit Mage. Somewhat surprised on this one that you have a C minus. I can see. I have theories as to why. I'll let you say them. But 2 and a blue for 2/2 that draws you into an artifact card at 4 or 5 mana. Um, uh, 3 mana 2/2 draw a card of your choice is pretty powerful, especially when that card of your choice can be your very next turn's play, or if you happen to already have a next turn's play, draw to your next turn after that, right? So it just gives you a lot of options here.
Right. So my reason is why I'm low on it is like I compare this to Micromancer, right? I think Micromancer is the obvious comparison here. But the thing about Micromancer that made it really good is there were so many good one-crossed instants and sorceries. I kind of did like a quick look through the deck at artifacts at 4 or 5, and yeah, they're there, right? But I don't think like the ones that you would probably be playing in a blue deck usually. So in other words, ones that have blue in their casting cost or ones that are just purely color, like I mean, they're there. Certainly you can find some cards, but I don't see any of them where I'm like, oh man, this one is just killer and I absolutely want to have it. And I'm gonna play copies of Transit Mage here to make sure I get it. Like, I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's something I missed in there, but I'm just looking at it and I'm like, I'm not sure this doesn't really impress me.
I was going to say, learn from your mistakes, Matt. Micromancer, you doubted, and it was good. This is somewhat similar to that.
Okay, but what are you fetching with it? Like, like
the whole set is full of artifacts. So I'll be honest, I didn't like check the 4 and 5
right. But
mana
that's the thing. I
cards.
went through and I looked and I was like, okay, I sorted by,
All right.
mana value, and I looked at like artifacts and I'm like, maybe that one, but not really. I mean, sure, you'll find targets for it, but I think if it was just search for if it was search for an artifact with mana value 4 or less or something like that, I think it would be insanely good. But like the fact that it's, specifically 4 or 5, um, you got to have exactly the right artifact, and you got to get it in your draft, and you got to put it in your deck, or this card is basically do nothing.
I'm doing all those things. I'm more than happy to. But there are certain things like it's a 2/2 for 3 that's underpowered and a set that deals with max speed and stuff like that too. That like there's things where I could see that this is a liability, but yeah, I don't know. I'm gonna play it. I'm gonna be happy to play it, and I'm pretty sure it'll perform well. We'll see. Up next, we have Marauding Mako. This is a 1-drop for a 1/1. Whenever you discard 1 or more cards, put that many +1/+1 counters on this creature, and it itself has cycling too. We mentioned getting on board early. This can crew your things that need to crew at 1 or more. I like the cycling cards pretty much in general across the board, so I'll be drafting a lot of those, and we'll be getting my +1/+1 counters to either crew or just have a 1 mana, 2/2, 3/3, whatever. The thing that would suck is if you drew this late, except it has cycling. So it covers all the bases for me.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's good. I'm probably a little low on it at a D plus, but I would probably not. I'm not a huge fan of 1-drops. This one is a little bit better in a lot of ways, but it's really only good in one archetype, and that is the blue-red archetype. I think that if you get this in most of the other archetypes, you're not going to want to play it. And maybe in a super aggro like red black, this fits. Just to get a 1-drop on the board early and start swinging turn 2. Start your engines, swing in on turn 2 if you have the play. Like there are maybe certain use cases for it, but in most of those situations, I'd probably find a better card. And so. I think this is to me, this is like a D plus most of the time, and maybe a C in a if you're playing blue red already. But other than that, I'm not sure this is going to find a lot of use.
Fair enough. And then lastly, on the cards that I was higher than Matt, we have Diversion Unit, a 2/1 flyer for 2, and it has the ability pay a blue and sacrifice it, counter target instant or sorcery spell unless its controller pays 3. I'm a sucker for a 2-power, 2-mana flyer, first off. There is downside in the set with the 1/1 Thopter flyers, that can block this and kill it. So, it has that. But there's the buyout here of being able to control your opponent, for so long with the instant sorceries when you can't attack in with this. So I liked all that enough to bring me to a B-.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about it for me is it's the limit on instant and sorcery, I think really, really hampers this card, right? Because if your opponent's just playing creatures and whatever, they'll just wait for you to tap out because you will eventually tap out, and then then they'll slam down their removal spell or whatever, right? And I just think that you can just so easily play around this card, and like you said, it dies to all of the Thopter generators, and there's plenty of those in this that I'm just like, sure, this card will find a niche, and maybe this is my 40th playable in a lot of deck, or my 23rd playable in a lot of decks. But I don't know. I find a hard time putting it above maybe a C minus, just because I think that it's not going to impact the board as much as most people are going to want it to. Like they know it's there, so they can play around it, right?
Right, but that's part of the benefit is like they're playing around it, but that means they aren't doing it. Like they aren't actually playing their instant sorcery because they can't because of this. Like this is one of those
Sure,
cards
but I
where the
mean,
value you
eventually
don't see.
you'll
Yeah,
eventually get to the point where it's turn 5 and they've got 5 mana and they play their 2-cost removal spell, and then you blow this up. But it's like, okay, you've maybe delayed some of their other play for a turn, but I just don't,
yeah,
I don't
yeah.
know.
Fair enough.
I see this the most use case I see for this is actually in crewing something,
Yeah.
right? Because you can activate that ability even when it's tapped, and then that's probably the best use case I have is like put this in a deck where you've got to crew something with 2.
Can I win you any points or partial grades by the fact that this is an artifact for Haunt the Network?
Maybe, yeah. I mean, I think that I mean, it's certainly a deck that you're going to put in, or a card that you're going to put in a control deck, right? And so, sure, yeah. If I'm playing like either white, blue, or blue, black, then maybe this fine is a little bit higher, maybe a C. I would not put it to a B minus though. I don't think it pulls
Okay.
me into blue.
Yeah, fair enough. I could be a little high on it.
Next up, we've got the cards that I rated higher than Jeremy in uncommon. And so first up, we have Back on Track, cost 4 colorless and 1 black, sorcery. Return target creature or vehicle card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Create a 1/1 colorless pilot token. With this token, saddles, mounts, and cruise vehicles as though its power is 2 or greater. And I'm interested to hear why you're so low on this, because you really usually like the cards that are create 2 things for 1 card. I know this is a little expensive, but the ability to bring something powerful back from your graveyard and get a 1/1 that crews at a much higher level for 5, I think that's really good.
I don't like reanimation spells costing 5 because I'd rather just play like a 5-mana creature or whatever. Like I don't know. I'd rather it be its own creature. I also don't totally see this as 2 things because it's really kind of one thing, the pilot to enable the vehicle. Admittedly,
Creature or
there's
vehicle, though. You can bring back a creature with it.
oh yeah. I mean that does make it a little bit better. I don't know. I don't love these at 5 mana. I like the white one at 4 mana a lot more. And that one reanimates the artifact too. Like, if you did bring back a vehicle, for example, the pilot can only can be used on offense or defense, right? It's not both. Like,
Right.
there's yeah. Admittedly, this is like a synergy thing. Like if I
Right.
had that great
Yes.
cycling card or something that I really wanted to bring something back, like I'd play it, right? But until I have that great thing that can get into my graveyard that I want to reanimate, I don't love these cards.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I'm probably high on it at a B, but I do really like this card, and I think it's one of the I think it's going to be one of the signpost black uncommons that play in multiple archetypes, because we've talked about the black green archetype having recursion, we've talked about the white black archetype having recursion. Now, admittedly, both of those are probably going to be pretty bad archetypes, but I do think if you're playing those archetypes, this is the kind of card you want to play. Next up, we have Unswerving Sloth. For 3 colorless and 2 white, you get a 5/5 sloth mount with saddle 4, so pretty high saddle cost. But whenever this creature attacks while saddled, it gains indestructible until end of turn and untap all creatures you control. So effectively, this saddles for free as long as you have power 4 in other creatures to saddle it. And it's attacking indestructible every turn, basically. So, and it untaps itself too. So it's usable on the defense too. I mean, I don't see a downside to this one.
It's a 5 mana 5/5 without an enter the battlefield ability. That's a big downside. When you do saddle this, those creatures are not attacking in. Now they do untap,
Right.
but they themselves are not getting in. And then all you've gotten is a 5/5 indestructible that can be chump blocked away, right? Like,
Sure, but it's gonna slowly whittle down your opponent pretty significantly.
yeah, and it's a little too slow for me. D plus might be a little low. I'm willing to come up a little bit. It's probably better at like a C minus in my mind. I really judge 5 mana plays that do not come with an enter the battlefield ability really harshly. And this is double white. F5, that's not a huge deal, but
Right. I
yeah,
don't
I
know.
don't know.
I see it. I see this card as if your opponent doesn't have an answer for this card, they're gonna lose the game, right?
But you also need to be able to have to saddle it too. Otherwise, just a 5 mana 5/5. Like, I don't know. There's a lot of conditional
Yeah,
things
but
going on
I don't
here.
know. I mean, it shouldn't be. There's a 0/4 that saddles as or mount or taps as with
I don't like
its.
that card either.
I know, but I'm saying that alone saddles this, right?
Yeah.
That where it saddles with toughness rather than power, right? now that's just one of many things that you could use for that. But my point is, like, I don't know. I like this card a lot. We'll see how it performs. I could be way too high on it. I'm gonna try this card out a few times and see how it does.
With all the removal that's out there too, saddle it. That goes on the stack. Kill this thing.
Right, right.
Does that-
I get that you might be able you might saddle things, and then the untap is a separate sentence, so yeah, it has to resolve for you to untap the creature. Yeah, there are ways in which you can get gamed on this, but I don't know if your opponent doesn't have the removal in hand, they're probably losing the game against this one.
Yep.
All right, so next up we have Reckless Velocitor. You get for 3 colorless and a red, you get a 3/3 Minotaur Pilot. When this creature saddles a mount or crews a vehicle during your main phase, that mount or vehicle gets +2/+0 and gains trample until end of turn. So we were talking just now about the sloth and how it didn't have trample. Well, here's a way to give it trample. Anyways, I like this card because it gives trample, right? Like, it's understated for what it is, but trample is a really good ability. And later in the game, being able to give something +2/+0 and trample every turn is going to help you potentially close out a game. So in and of itself, this card I think is not impressive, but the reason I like it is because it will help you close out games.
Yeah. I like the statement better of in and of itself, this card isn't impressive. Yeah, I don't know. I think I was originally even higher on this, and then I saw, well, this is actually just a 4-mana 3/3. I mean, you're not playing it for that. You're playing it for the saddle ability, I guess. But I don't know. It's also a 4-mana enters the battlefield. It doesn't actually do anything. Now there is a little bit of it can crew something right away.
Right, you
So
can use it. You can mount or crew right away, even with summoning sickness. So this
yeah,
does do something when it enters the battlefield.
yeah. All right, you got me up to D plus. We'll see. I could see myself being wrong on this one though.
Right, I think I mean, again, it's the deck you play it in, right? I
Yeah,
viewed this card as a B- in aggro decks,
yeah,
right? You're not going to play this in a control deck. You're not going to play this in a slower deck usually. This is going to be those games where you need to close out the game, and you can play this on turn 4, and either turn 4 or turn 5, this will help you close out the game. So next up, we have Momentum Breaker. For 1 colorless and 1 black, you get an enchantment. It has Start Your Engines. When this enters, each opponent sacrifices a creature or vehicle of their choice. Each opponent who can't discards a card. And then you can pay 2 colorless to sacrifice this and gain life equal to your speed. So the reason I like this card is because, well, you want to play this early, generally, while your opponent only has 1 creature out. That's when you're going to have the most effect. That's also when it's going to have the most effect with Start Your Engines. But even if your opponent doesn't have a card or doesn't have a creature out, it forces them to discard a card. So you're never unless your opponent has no creatures and no cards in hand, you're going to get a benefit from this. And if your opponent has no creatures and no cards in hand, you've probably won the game already. But then also, you get a later game bonus with this of being able to sacrifice this and gain probably up to 4 life. So I like the efficiency of this card. I like that it can do multiple things. Sure, if given a choice, they might just sacrifice their 1/1 or something like that. But even in this set, that's going to mean you probably have
yeah.
1 less thing you can crew. And so I think overall, this is a pretty good card in my mind.
Yeah, your last statement is the most attractive of it, right? Like, I don't really love edicts because it puts
Right.
the choice on your opponent to do whatever's best for them, and you know, I guess the key is there anything good for them? Like, because it's either crewing things or it's a vehicle themselves. I guess I wonder if they have multiple vehicles out and they can't crew all their vehicles,
Right.
then they can just
Might be
sacrifice their worst one and it doesn't really impact them that much, right?
right.
Like, so there's those cases that I don't like. Being able to eventually gain life on top of all that though is nice. So I'm probably low on this. Come up to C minus type of thing, but yeah, I can see your point.
Next up, we have Hellish Sideswipe. For 1 black, you get as an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice an artifact or creature, destroy target creature or vehicle. If the sacrificed permanent was a vehicle, draw a card. So I like this because it's cheap removal. You get to choose what you're sacrificing to it, right? You could, sacrifice that one mana cost bauble, right, to kill a creature, right? There's a lot of ways you could synergize with this card. If you have a creature that you no longer need to crew something because you've made there's a lot of artifact or a lot of vehicles that can become artifact creatures later on, and you may no longer need the pilot. There's a lot of instances where I think this card will see a lot of good play. And if you sacrifice a vehicle with it, you get to draw a card, right? And so you have a choice of, for one mana, basically sacrifice something, kill their permanent, draw a card to replace whatever you sacrificed. And so I think this is decent removal.
Yeah, I'm low on this one. Like my grade is too low, I think. You got me with the bauble thing. I think that would be great. The 3/1 artifact that when it enters battlefield gives +2/+0 and trample, like sacrificing that to this, like because you already got your trick effect, right? Like, and you get to draw a card then too. So I think there's enough combos that this goes up in value. I don't like that it doesn't have the typical buyout of like you can pay 4 extra mana to not
Right.
sacrifice
Yeah.
something, right?
Yeah.
So that brings it down quite a bit for me, which is why I was at C minus. I think I'm now going to go at a C, maybe like a synergy C plus type of thing when you have enough combos, right? Like you can actively make this good.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think
Yeah.
it's like the active treason with the similar card like this. If you've got enough of those other things that make this card good, it'll be really good. Otherwise, it will be mediocre, but still decent.
Yeah.
All right, next up we have Aether Siphon. For 1 colorless and 2 blue, you get an artifact with Start Your Engines. You can pay 2 and tap it to draw a card, and max speed. Whenever you draw a card, each opponent mills 2 cards. I just like this because it's a reusable draw card. Paying 2 to draw a card each turn is not bad, especially later in the game especially if you're playing like blue green and you've got some ramp in your deck and you can get up there in your mana pretty quick, you won't mind spending 2 mana every turn to draw an extra card. That's just going to be an incredible amount of card advantage.
I feel like there's better ways to get card advantage, but I admit that I think this set is a little lower on that than we've typically
There's
seen.
not a lot of, I mean, there's like if you're playing blue, red and you have a lot of loot, yeah, maybe. But other than that, there's not a ton. Like I don't even think we have the pay 5 to draw 3. Right. I don't even think that card's in this set or some version of that card. It might be.
It effectively is with the blue-white signpost. It
Right.
has affinity for art. It's 7, but affinity for artifacts.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, you're right. But there's less of that, certainly.
Yeah.
So but I don't know. I like that it has Start Your Engines, and then I also like. I mean, the max speed thing on this is kind of. I'm not sure you're ever going to care about milling your opponents out, but yeah, every time you draw a card, milling your opponent for 2, that could
Yeah.
end some games.
I think it will. It's not a primary thing, but I think it will. Yeah, it's just so much mana. So you're not even getting you're getting nothing other than a Start Your Engines for the 3, and it's 2 blue, right? It's not a divination. You then have to invest 2 more just to draw 1, and then another 2, and then another 2. You can only do it once per turn because it taps. It just seems too much of an investment. And while I'm drawing those cards, I do not want to be wasting mana, right? I need the mana available to be casting the cards I drew. That's my concern
Yeah, but I
with it.
think once you get to like 6, 7 mana, which you'll do because you're drawing more cards to get more lands. I mean, I don't know. I also see there's a good value play with this card in blue red because it allows you to get extra cards with lands to loot away, right? I think you'll find some synergies with this in blue red to be able to just like draw those extra cards and then be like, oh, I have an extra land. So when I get my loot this turn, I'm going to discard a land or something like that. I don't know. I think there's some good use. I'm probably high on it at a B, but like, I like the card. We'll see how it plays.
Yep.
So next up, we have Alacrian Armory. For 3 colorless and 1 white, you get an artifact. Creatures you control get +0/+1 and have vigilance. And at the beginning of combat on your turn, you essentially get to choose a mount or vehicle, and that mount or vehicle will either become saddled or crewed. or no, sorry, it'll become saddled or an artifact creature if it's a vehicle, so it effectively becomes crewed. And I like this card because the +0/+1 in vigilance is really nice. Plus a free crew every turn means that you'll be able to crew crew artifact vehicles defensively because your creatures all have vigilance. And the free crew or saddle every turn is just nice for being able to get in and attack with something, and then potentially have it available as a blocker still. It's expensive. I'll give it that. I'd much rather this cost 3, but I do like it still, and I think it will in the right decks. I think it will really play well. I'm thinking this goes best in green white, actually. Maybe next best in blue white, but I think either of those will benefit pretty well from this.
Yeah, I think blue white gets the advantage of it's an artifact going to all your
Yes.
affinity for artifacts as well.
Yep.
It does effectively have enter the battlefield ability because
Yep.
it does it the first turn. So all that's going for it. What I don't like is it's not a creature on the battlefield or battlefield impact
Right.
itself, right? And so it's a waste of a card, for lack of a better term.
But
It takes a lot for me to
here's where I might get you.
grade those high.
It frees up like a creature that you would normally have to use elsewise to either crew or saddle something.
Yep.
And so in and of itself it's not a creature, but it effectively gives you a creature, and it gives all your creatures vigilance, so it gives you defenders and attackers at the same time.
Yeah, I think this is one like I'm willing to come up on it. I need to see it in play. I'm not ready to budge right now, but yeah, open to it.
Yeah. And so last up, we have a card that we've actually discussed. We talked about this in the signpost uncommons. It's Broodheart Engine. We kind of talked about this, but briefly, it's a black and a green artifact. At the beginning of your upkeep, surveil 1, and then you have the ability to pay 4 essentially and sacrifice it to recur something in either a vehicle or a creature from the graveyard to the battlefield. You can only activate that as a sorcery. We'll see how this plays out. I mean, I think it's a weak archetype to begin with, but I mean, I think the card will play pretty well because a surveil every turn is nice. The ability to, if you've got enough lands already and you don't want to draw more lands, you can decide you're not going to probably draw as many lands. It helps to prevent flooding. And I see that honestly as its primary value. I like the recursion as a secondary value, but more so than anything, I don't like flooding out, and this card's going to help prevent you from doing that.
Yeah, this surveil is the primary benefit here. Like it wouldn't be playable though without the second ability,
Yes.
right? Like because
Yeah,
you can't just have something like surveil. It's got to bring back some value down the line. It does that. It's just I don't like a 6 mana reanimate effectively. I know it's spread over turns, and I don't know. Yeah, I haven't seen enough of the graveyard recursion. Again, I'm not convinced by it, right? So like there's part of just a bias there of I don't think this will be a great archetype either. I do see this more as something I'd be more willing to play late in the format rather than early in the format, like after things slow down and even out. But yeah, I'm sticking with a D for now, and then I can see it coming up
right.
over time.
Notably, this is one where I only had it at a C plus, so I don't think this draws me into black green. I think there's very little that will draw me into black green. But I think it's still gonna. I mean, if you're playing black green, you want to play this card basically, and that's kind of why I put it at a C plus. It's probably more like a C, maybe a C minus in my book. But like, it's one of those. Okay, if you're in this archetype and you're playing that archetype, you want this card, and you probably want multiple of this card. So, but
Right.
you probably don't want to play that archetype. So that's the other thing. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this content. And if you think we got some of these card ratings wrong, or if you think, one of our arguments pulled you up on some card ratings, let us know.
So that's our review of the top commons, uncommons, and our biggest grading differences. Thanks again for joining us. And next time, we'll be going over the initial impressions after playing the Aetherdrift format. See you in that one.
See you in the next one.